Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan, and I am going solo this afternoon. Paul and I are going to start trying to do more videos and podcasts. Some of them, the majority of them, of course, will be us together in dialogue, but we're each going to do a number of ones that might have interviews or with separate thoughts. Paul has already put out a few on Ukraine, etc. in the past. So hopefully this is something you all will enjoy. And the reason I'm doing this one today is in regards to President Trump in a meeting with Netanyahu in the White House, declaring that the United States will take over the Gaza Strip, the area of Palestine, the occupied lands, and go ahead and do the rebuilding. Meanwhile, he signified that he wants Arab nations to take in the Palestinians, and hopefully that would be a permanent solution, but at least until they do the rebuilding, the cleanup, etc., the Palestinians then would move back in. Now, the question that has to be done, though, is this the standard President Trump doing a boisterous, highfalutin demand of what he wants to do, or is it rather something to rile up the opposition in order to get them fired up to then jump in and do something themselves? We have to take a look at what the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said shortly after President Trump made this declaration in a meeting with one of the mainstream medias. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz confirms that Trump's proposal to, quote, take over Gaza, unquote, is meant to pressure neighboring Arab nations to come together and come up with their own solution. It's going to bring the entire region to come up with, i.e., their own solutions. So, while some may think this is 5D chess and Trump saying one thing while actually intending another, the reality is that in many instances, this is exactly the way Trump operates. And the reason you know Trump operates is because it's written in his book, The Art of the Deal. When you go into any type of negotiations, you make wild demands, knowing that your opponent across the table is going to make their similar wild demands, and hopefully you come to a consensus, an agreement that both sides will be happy with. Now, one of the reasons why I was thinking about this is because of a couple of tweets that Paul actually put out earlier today regarding the fall of the Soviet Union and its similarities to the United States. Now, let me take a look at this from the both sides in regards to Paul's words. One of his tweets, he said, "The Soviet Union collapsed because no one was prepared to challenge the establishment from the inside, i.e. the status quo, and everyone inside had to keep cheerleading that the Soviet Union was powerful and successful. Anyone on the outside could see it was collapsing very rapidly. The U.S. is doing precisely what the Soviet Union did." Okay, now let's take a look at something else of when that fall actually took place. Understanding that Soviet premiers could not actually come out and say that the Soviet Union was failing, nor could anybody in the Politburo. They had to play the party lines. And this, of course, led the Soviet Union to last far longer and to go into much more dire straits than had they come up with a solution back in the Brezhnev years in the 1970s. Here's what Paul had to say about the Gorbachev era. Gorbachev era was to break up the Soviet Union, then isolate Russia, send it back to the economic and financial Stone Age, and then let the Western-backed oligarchs effectively steal all the assets. Well, in large part, that happened until Vladimir Putin took over and jailed many of the oligarchs, gave them a deal where they could keep their money, but they had to give up their possessions to Russian assets and Russian resources. At the same time, he kicked out the banks, the Western banks, and their facilitators, and that was the start of the rise of the new Russia, the Russian Federation. Okay, so Gorbachev had to have some type of assurances to be able to allow for the Soviet Union to dissolve, because he couldn't do it by appealing to those on the inside, despite the fact that they knew the Soviet Union had reached its very end. So what happened? Well, we have President Reagan at the time coming out and demanding Gorbachev tear down that wall. And then, of course, he invested in Star Wars, which is something that the bankrupt Soviet Union couldn't compete with, even if it was really just something on paper and not really a true project that was feasible. But it was enough to scare those on the inside to be willing to change and to be willing to sacrifice their power position and come up with a solution, which led, of course, to the dissolution in 1991 under President Bush of the ending of the Soviet Union and the freedom for nations like Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, etc. Now, something else that was done at the time, of course, is the Secretary of State, James Baker, under the first President Bush, he made assurances, and there is written signed documents by him and a number of NATO nations, especially Germany, that said that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward towards Russia, providing them the security they needed while giving up their buffer zone of Eastern European nations, giving up that buffer zone, and they wouldn't have to worry about that. Of course, over time, because the West thought Russia was completely shattered, even when Putin was early in there, they just decided to use NATO in whatever capacity they wanted to, and it's led to the Ukraine conflict today. Now, fast forward to this, okay? It was the need for assurances, it was the need for fear that the United States would have a superior firepower in Star Wars that led the Soviet Union to finally collapse and say enough. Well, is this something that President Trump wants to do by declaring that the United States will go in and occupy Gaza, occupy and rebuild and have total control of it, not Israel and not the other Arab states? And of course, he is trying to foist the 1.7 million Palestinians onto nations like Egypt, Jordan, etc. They're mostly hanging out in Jordan right now. Egypt is a no-go because it is likely Sisi holds on to power with a very tenuous thread. So having that many refugees in there, especially with ones that may have Hamas affiliations, that is not going to work well, because if they are there for a longer period of time, then the potential of a civil war in Egypt could arise. So this leaves Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, to finally, maybe Qatar, UAE, to finally come up with some type of real, tangible solution to the two-state problem, to the region and to the Middle East. Well, we already know that under MBS, there has been a change where what used to be a conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., they came through with an agreement and are starting to have relations again. But then both of those nations were starting to reach out to Assad before he abdicated and Syria fell. So we already have leaders in West Asia that are willing to try to make deals for the sake of peace and for the sake of development in that region of the world. And it's kind of interesting because a former Israeli spy, one that was released, I believe, under the Biden administration, Jonathan Pollard, known for stealing the Pentagon secrets and that potentially led to the creation of the atomic programs in Israel. He warned that Donald Trump is not a true ally of Israel and is covertly working against its interests. He claims Trump's pro-Israel actions are purely transactional, with support coming at a price. Israel was expected to make concessions as part of a larger deal rather than receiving the unwavering backing, which is what suddenly Trump hit Netanyahu with today. We are completely behind you, and we will move in to Gaza, protect Israel, and protect that part of the region. Well, here's the interesting thing. If somebody like Pollard believes that Trump is doing it not as an ally of Israel, but for his own interests are to get out of the region in all capacity while having peace reign in the area. So that's the question that needs to be done. We have Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, coming out and saying that this was just simply a statement to fire up the Middle East and have them find their own solutions rather than allow the United States to go in there and dictate terms. We have Pollard, who thinks that there is something nefarious, well, I don't want to say nefarious, but alternative, working against Israel's interests. And then, of course, what is the most important thing? Well, one of the big fears that has been going on, especially what we see in Syria, is the fear that if Israel goes in and occupies, then they are going to create into Gaza their own desires and their own interests when it comes to the occupied territories, and that is not a two-state solution. But what Donald Trump did is, there with Netanyahu next to him, he took all of the legs out from under Netanyahu and said, we are in charge of the allocation and what happens in Gaza, not you, not anybody else. We are the ones that the nations have to go through before decisions are going to be made. So, and really what that is that the U.S. is going to oversee it, but hopefully it's going to oversee a mediation between the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, maybe even Iran, Israel, etc., to come through with a permanent solution. So, like I said, this is something to take with a grain of salt. Sometimes you got to read between the lines. Sometimes you got to take several different viewpoints of credible sources and see what comes together and see if we can find some sort of conclusion or at least direction where things are going to go. In the Middle East / West Asia, things are never what they seem, and chaos has reigned there for the last several thousand years. So with that being said, I want to thank everybody as always for being a part of the Sirius Report community. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think might be important. Leave in the comments any of your thoughts regarding this. If what I'm putting together is just pie in the sky and I'm full of bovine excrement, or if there's some feasibility that this might be an avenue or an angle that the Trump administration is looking towards, and we'll go ahead and go from there. So to everybody here, until the next time we get together, have a great day.